We just have faith in that, we just accept that, then automatically we're saved. There is no active part of, we don't need to be actively participating in our redemption. We just have this faith. He also advocated sola scriptura, which again we've seen has been as a foundation, Protestant foundational teaching, advocated by Luther, Calvin, and others. In 1548 in England, there's an outbreak of iconoclasm. We talked about this with the Second Council of Nicaea in the 8th century, how the Byzantines actually then began to promulgate that it was from the emperor that we could not have sacred images, that mosaics or statues or stained glass were considered idolatry. And so in England, there's an outbreak of iconoclasm where the destruction of images begin to take place around the country. Clerical marriage was authorized by the House of Lords, also under Cranmer's tutelage here in 1548, moving the church in England away from the practice and the discipline of celibacy. Cranmer authorizes divorce for adultery, begins to change some of the teachings of the church. He prohibits, in particular, the elevation of the host at Mass. So he begins, as we've seen, in other time periods with Martin Luther, the Protestants begin to abolish the Mass or try to change the Mass. It's one of the first things that they do whenever they take over in an area is to try to get rid of the celebration of the Mass or change it fundamentally. And this is what Cranmer does. Eventually, also in the same year, 1548, Cranmer will publish the first Book of Common Prayer. And this is where he takes the liturgy in England and he changes it completely from the Mass. He attacks the Mass and changes it and makes it something different, and by doing so he begins to lead England very rapidly into heresy. Now actually the Book of Common Prayer, he issued 2 editions of it. The first one was in 1548, the second one was in 1552. Between these 2 versions, or editions rather, of the Book of Common Prayer, what he does is he abolishes the Mass, he outlaws Eucharistic adoration and processions throughout England, and he maintains, or he requires, all citizens of England to attend Anglican services using this new Book of Common Prayer every Sunday. So no longer could you attend a Catholic Mass or Catholic liturgy in England. If you attended a Catholic Mass in England during this time of Cranmer's rule, you could be imprisoned from anywhere from 6 months to a year. So we begin to see here in the early stages of England's move into heresy, persecution of the church and persecution of Catholics, which will reach its peak under the reign of Elizabeth I. And what's interesting, the reason why Cranmer had 2 different editions of the Book of Common Prayer, one in 1548 and one in 1552, is because when the first edition came out, John Calvin actually received a copy of it, and he read through it. He wrote a letter back to Cranmer and basically told him that he didn't go far enough in moving the liturgy in England away from the Catholic Mass. He needed to be even more strict and even more moving away from the church in Rome. And so then he went back and revised it, came out with this second edition. In 1550, Cranmer actually wrote a work on the Eucharist, and this is what he said: Christ called bread his body and wine his blood, and these sentences be figurative speeches. The substance of bread and wine do remain still. In plain speech, it is not true that we eat Christ's body and drink his blood. So the man who is orchestrating the removal of England from the Catholic Church completely into heresy now advocates here in this writing his understanding that the Eucharist, there is no real presence in the Eucharist, that it's just a symbol, it's just figurative. So he has fully and completely embraced Protestant teachings. Another thing that he does, Cranmer has done, is he issues a new ordinal. And an ordinal is the manual that's used to ordain men to the priesthood. And the ordinal not only has the rite of ordination in it, but it also has the theology behind an understanding of what the priesthood is. And so he has this ordinal issued in 1550. It's known as the Edwardian Ordinal. And in this ordinal, he denies, and theologically, he denies the sacrificial nature of the priesthood. The priest is no longer acting in persona Christi. He is no longer representing Christ's sacrifice on Calvary in the Mass. Instead, the Mass, instead of the Anglican liturgy, is just it's symbol. There's no real sacrificial nature to the priesthood. As a result of issuing this ordinal, really what happens in England is the apostolic succession is broken. So as this ordinal is used year after year after year from this time in 1550, then apostolic succession begins to be broken. Because if you're not handing on the nature of the priesthood as always taught and understood and believed and lived by the Catholic Church for the last several thousand years. And so he moves, this is another break. It's these two things, the Book of Common Prayer and the Edwardian Ordinal, that really move England firmly into heresy under Archbishop Cranmer. Interestingly enough, it was the 19th century, in 1896, Leo XIII issued one of his writings concerning Anglican orders, and he said that Anglican orders were null and void because of the issuance of the Edwardian Ordinal. So that's why today, when we have men from the Episcopal Church in the United States or the Anglican Church in England, if they decide to leave those communities and become a Catholic, if they want to also, if they feel called to continue a vocation of priesthood, then those men are actually ordained Catholic priests. They're not just accepted. Their ordination from the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church is not just accepted as being valid, because it's not. Those orders are no longer valid and haven't been since the 16th century. Ultimately, in 1558, the young Edward VI dies. He was only 16 years old. And so now England is faced with the question of who becomes the monarch. And although there's a brief reign of Lady Jane Grey as queen for just only for a few days, ultimately who comes to the throne is Henry VIII's daughter from Catherine of Aragon, Mary Tudor. Mary would reign as Queen of England from 1553 to 1558. And a description of her, she was not of good health and was not necessarily a pretty woman. And this is one description of her. She was of bad health, short, prematurely aged, looked 15 years older than she was. She had a rough, deep voice, almost like a man's, a head too big for her body, and altogether an unimpressive presence. And in her relations with the men and women about her, she was much too ready to believe in the good and to doubt the evil. So despite that description, though, Mary was a very good monarch, and she had as her goal, one of the things that she believed firmly about herself was that God had placed her on the throne to restore the Catholic faith to England. That was her primary objective, and how she saw her role as monarch in England was that God had specifically placed her there so that she could restore Catholicism to England, and that's what she endeavored to do. Now, one of the things, before we talk about that, before how Mary brought about the restoration of the faith in England, we have to acknowledge that Mary had a slight problem. Actually, it was a very large problem. Mary's problem was that she was not married. She was somewhat old when she came to the throne. She's 37 years old. She did not have an heir. She was concerned that if she died, then the throne might go to her half-sister, or would go to her half-sister, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had embraced Protestant tenets. And so if Mary worked really hard to restore the faith in England, that faith would be taken away with the arrival of her half-sister, so Elizabeth, to the throne. So she wanted to ensure, and there was great concern in her court, that she find a husband. Now, interesting, who comes into the picture and offers a husband-to-be, offers a suggestion as to who she should take as her husband, is the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whom we've met in our last time period in terms of his relationship with Martin Luther. So Charles V comes into the picture, and he brings a suitor, and his suitor is his own son, Philip II of Spain. So Mary agrees to marry Philip. Philip comes to England. Now there was a great discord in the country because of this potential marriage. The English people, they loved their monarch, they loved the Catholic faith, but they also very much loved their country, and they were very wary of any kind of Spanish or foreign influence coming into their country. So they viewed this potential marriage and ultimate marriage in a somewhat negative light. Philip comes to England. They had a very interesting way to communicate in their marriage. Mary could understand Spanish, but she could not speak Spanish. So Philip spoke to her in Spanish. But Mary could speak French. Philip could understand French, but he couldn't speak French. So they communicated very straight. It's a good way, I guess, to have communication in marriage. If you can understand each other's language, but you can't speak it. So it makes for very interesting dinner discussions and what have you. You could always say, you wanted me to do what? I didn't understand that. You could always try to feign ignorance of things. It gives you a nice out in some of those cases. The thing with this relationship and this marriage, though, is that Mary really loved Philip. Mary had a great devotion and loved Philip. Unfortunately, Philip did not return that love in kind. He really was unhappy being in England. He didn't like the climate. He wasn't really thrilled with being married to Mary. He knew that the major reason for the marriage was kind of politically motivated. So it really caused for a somewhat rocky relationship despite their communication problems. Now Mary, though, remember I said that her whole goal of her reign was to restore the faith to England, and this is what she did. In 1553, she convened Parliament. Where she had Parliament repeal the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage, her father's marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. So again, to declare that marriage was actually valid. She repealed all of the religious legislation passed under Edward VI, her predecessor, and she allowed the Mass to be celebrated instead in England again. Thomas Cranmer was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower and eventually executed in 1556. Now, one of the main men who helped Mary bring the faith back and restore the faith back to England was a man by the name of Cardinal Reginald Pole. Reginald Pole, during this whole time of Henry VIII and Edward VI, had been studying overseas in Italy and in Rome. He was sent back to England by Pope Julius III to be his representative, his legate in England. He came and he was present at this 1553 session of Parliament, and he encouraged everyone in Parliament to vote for the restoration and to bring England back. And that's what Parliament did. Ultimately, in November of 1554, Parliament voted to rejoin the Catholic Church, and they asked absolution for the schism and for the heresy from Cardinal Pole, who accepted it. The House of Lords voted unanimously to restore the faith to England. The House of Commons, all but 2 members of the House of Commons, voted to return England to the faith. So again, just an interesting data point to prove and to show that the English people at heart really were still aligned with the Church and with the Holy Father in Rome. Pole granted absolution to England and accepted her return into the Catholic faith. Now, Mary Tudor had this great accomplishment. She restored the faith to England, and that's something that's really not necessarily taught as much in our schools and when we consider English history during this period of time. Usually what we hear about Mary Tudor, and she's always usually referred to as Bloody Mary. This is the image we always have of Mary Tudor, that she was this horrible monarch that killed lots of people, and it was a dark time in England until her half-sister Elizabeth came, and then we had the golden age of England. That's the prevalent myth, really, that's perpetuated in our history textbooks about this period of time. We never hear about Mary's restoration of the faith. We always hear about Bloody Mary. So let's look at this moniker of Bloody Mary and see, is it historically accurate? Is it appropriate and historically truthful to actually refer to Mary as Bloody Mary? It is true that during Mary's reign, she rounded up, arrested, and executed Protestants. This is true. But she did so because these Protestants were a threat, a direct threat, to her rule as queen and to her main objective of restoring the faith to the Church. She did not arrest and round up Protestants simply because they were Protestant. She rounded them up and had them arrested and tried because they were a threat to the throne and they were a threat to the restoration of the faith in England. So how many people did Mary kill? She's given this name, Bloody Mary, so usually in our minds we have this image of thousands of Englishmen rounded up and killed and persecuted under Mary's brief 5-year reign as Queen of England. Actually, the total number was 273. 273 people were arrested, tried, and convicted as being a threat to the crown, and then executed. Now, what's interesting is that usually Mary is referred to, as I said, as Bloody Mary, and her sister, her half-sister Elizabeth, is always known as Good Queen Bess. So Mary had 273 people executed during her reign. Elizabeth we have over 700 known and documented cases of martyrdom during Elizabeth's reign. Over 700. There's much more, but there are 700 known and well-documented cases of martyrdom. The difference between Mary and Elizabeth was Mary arrested people who were a direct threat to her throne and to the restoration of the faith in England. Elizabeth arrested people and passed laws to have people arrested, tried, and executed simply because they were Catholic. Not necessarily because they were a threat to the throne, although there were those who were, but simply by being Catholic or being a Catholic priest or associating with a Catholic priest, you could be arrested, tried, convicted, and executed in Elizabethan England. And we'll see some of those examples of that in a minute. Now, Mary Tudor dies in 1558. the legitimate successor to the throne, the one who really should have taken the throne of England instead of her half-sister Elizabeth, was Mary Stuart, or sometimes known as Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary Stuart was Queen of England, or Queen of Scotland, when she was very young, only 16 years of age. She also, for a brief time, had been married to Francis II, King of France, so she was also Queen of France for only 1 year, though, before he died. She was a legitimate successor to the throne, and she had her tie to the throne through Henry VIII because she was Henry VIII's great-great-niece. Mary Stuart was Henry VIII's great-great-niece. She had to leave Scotland, though, because of a Protestant revolt that occurred in Scotland during this time under John Knox. John Knox was a political and religious revolutionary. He was a very tough man. He had spent 2.5 years as a French galley slave. So the galley slaves, to be in the galley was hard work, and many people did not survive their time as a galley slave. For him to actually have survived 2.5 years under those type of conditions and then escape is quite remarkable. John Knox said that he feared one mass more than 10,000 enemies. He was a very active anti-Catholic and wanted to see Catholicism stamped out and removed from all of Scotland. And he saw Mary Stuart as a threat to that, so he had her overthrown, and he abolished and removed the Catholic Church in Scotland. As a result of that, Mary Stuart had to flee Scotland, and instead of going to France or to some other Catholic nation that would have accepted her, for somewhat mysterious reasons, she flees to England. While she's in England, she's arrested by Elizabeth and placed in prison, held in prison for 20 years. Ultimately, Elizabeth was convinced by her advisors to have Mary Stuart executed. She was implicated in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth, and so she was then arrested and executed. And her execution really brought about and caused the Spanish Armada. Another story another event in the story of Western civilization and the church that we don't always get the true meaning of. We don't always receive the true reason for why the Armada was called. So we'll talk about why that happened, the impact in England of this execution of Mary Stuart, and the rise of Elizabeth I when we come back from this break. Here in the audience, those watching the DVDs in your parish or home, and listening as well on the audio. We've been talking about this period of Catholic Reformation. We're in our first session on this time period where the Church authentically reforms herself. And we're talking about the story of England and what happens in England during this time. And we last talked before the break about Mary Stuart and how she fled Scotland because of the persecution of her reign and also of the church there by John Knox. She flees to England. She's arrested by Elizabeth, kept in prison for 20 years, and then ultimately executed in 1587. And that really was one of the main reasons, political reasons, for the Spanish Armada. Now, many of us I know, myself included, when I was growing up and learning history in school and reading my history textbooks, I was always taught that the Spanish Armada, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, was one of the greatest events in the history of the world. It was a great thing that the Spanish were defeated and that England was not conquered by Spain. I never understood why that was such a great event, or really what was so significant about that event. But when you read and actually understand the real story of why the Armada was called, we come to realize and understand that the defeat of the Spanish Armada was not, in terms of understanding history from a Catholic perspective, such a great thing. Because the whole reason why the Armada was launched was to end the persecution of Catholics that was ongoing under the reign of Elizabeth. Because Philip, when the Armada sailed, King Philip wrote to his sailors, and he says this. He said, "This is why we're going to England. This is why we're going to invade England." He said, "There will also await us the groans of countless imprisoned Catholics, the tears of widows who lost their husbands for the faith, the sobs of maidens who were forced to sacrifice their lives rather than destroy their souls." So the Spanish Armada was launched primarily to return England to the faith. Remember how Philip had been married to Mary Tudor, and Mary Tudor's whole main objective as monarch, as Queen of England, was to restore the faith, which she was able to do, but then her half-sister came to the throne, Elizabeth, and took England away again from the faith. So Mary Stuart's death was a political event.